Welcome back, everyone. Today's deep dive is going to be pretty interesting. It's going to be about this report you sent over called Restructuring the Relationship Volume 2. And it looks at the history and future of treaties between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples in Canada.
It's a fascinating one.
Yeah.
It is a landmark document. It came out of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was a huge undertaking investigating the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada.
I was struck by this paradox, right? The treaties were meant to be these symbols of peace and coexistence, but in practice, their interpretation and implementation have caused a lot of tension.
Yeah.
And they raise big questions about justice and reconciliation.
Yeah, for sure. The report really digs into how treaties were the traditional way of defining intergovernmental relations in Canada. And so they really set the stage for peaceful coexistence.
So you're saying these early treaties were negotiated nation to nation and recognized Aboriginal nations as self-governing with their own systems of law and governance.
Yeah, and even today, lots of Aboriginal peoples see these treaties as the best way forward. They're trying to make new agreements about land claims and create self-government structures.
It seems like a really fundamental part of the relationship. But I noticed the report also digs into how complicated interpreting these treaties can be.
Oh, it's a huge point of debate.
Yeah.
Governments often focus on the written document as like the only agreement, but Aboriginal parties consider oral traditions and the spirit and intent as just as important.
It's like two different versions of the same story.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And on that point of different perspectives, it's pretty interesting that Canadian courts have often sided with that Aboriginal understanding.
Oh, really?
They actually prioritize a broader understanding of these historical treaties.
Okay.
Taking context and oral history into account.
Interesting. But then the report kind of hits us with the hard truth that many existing treaties haven't been fully honored by governments, and it says that broken trust makes reconciliation so much harder.
Yeah, it's a really difficult truth for sure. It makes you think, how can Canada really uphold justice when promises are broken?
Yeah, it raises a fundamental question about honoring these agreements.
It does. There is a little bit of hope, though. Some constitutional changes, like in the Constitution Act of 1982, recognize Aboriginal and treaty rights. So that's something.
So we've got this history of broken trust, but there is also this legal framework that at least recognizes some rights. Now, remember, the report lays out a vision for a new relationship built on these 4 interconnected pillars.
Yeah.
Can you walk me through those?
Absolutely. The report calls them treaties, governance lands and resources, and economic development.
Yeah,
Each one is kind of tied to treaty implementation and renewal. They're all connected.
They're all connected. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was this concept of treaty nations and how they're not just history, but living political communities with a right to self-government.
Absolutely. And that right is often challenged or ignored by non-Aboriginal governments. It's like the report's reminding everyone that these nations never agreed to just be absorbed into the Canadian state.
The report actually quotes Regina Crowchild, the president of the Indian Association of Alberta, who says only nations can enter into treaties.
Right.
Which really underlines how treaty nations see themselves.
It really emphasizes that nation-to-nation relationship. And that leads to a fascinating contrast.
Oh, tell me about this contrast.
Well, on the one hand, you have the treaty nations who see these agreements as sacred and really meaningful culturally and spiritually. And then you have the other view, often held by non-Aboriginal people, that sees them as outdated contracts, just legal documents.
Oh, I see how that would cause a lot of misunderstanding.
Oh, yeah.
The report actually shares a really good example of this from Nancy Louise Sampson of the Samson Cree Nation.
Oh, yeah.
She talks about the sacred pipe used during treaty signings and how it represents how serious the agreements were. It really shows just how big the cultural divide is.
It's such a good example. It really shows how important it is to consider what was meant beyond the written words. And that leads us to Aboriginal title.
Okay, Aboriginal title. So this is about the inherent rights of Aboriginal peoples to their traditional lands and territories, right?
Got it. And it's really interesting how treaty nations consistently say they agreed to share their lands, but not to give up their title.
It's a very different way of understanding land ownership.
Right.
The report mentions Chief Francois Paulette, who said, "In my language, there is no word for surrender."
Wow.
Which is powerful.
It is. It shows how much different cultural perspectives can clash, especially when talking about land. And that's where the Treaty 7 First Nations treaty review process comes in.
Oh.
They specifically focused on their understanding of the treaty as sharing, not surrendering.
So it sounds like treaty nations are actively working to reclaim their narrative and challenge those old misinterpretations. But there's a big problem here that the report really emphasizes. It's the lack of public awareness among non-Aboriginal Canadians about these treaties and how treaty nations see things.
That's a huge problem. It's a recipe for misunderstanding and even prejudice. So what does the report suggest we do about it?
Well, it stresses that education is key. It says we need comprehensive public education about treaties. We need to teach this in schools and use different types of media to tell the stories of these agreements.
That sounds like a good start. But what about the bigger picture? How do we actually move towards implementing and renewing these treaties?
That's where the report gets interesting. It calls for both sides, the treaty nations and the Crown, to work together with mutual respect.
I like that. It's not about one side dictating terms. It's about recognizing that everyone has a role to play.
And it calls for acknowledging the gaps in the historical record, right? Going beyond the written text.
Absolutely. Oral traditions and what was meant have to be considered along with the documents. It's about getting a fuller picture.
And it also suggests setting up a bilateral treaty process with treaty nations and the Crown working as equal partners.
That's a key recommendation. It's about creating a space for open dialogue and negotiation where both sides have an equal say.
And it quotes National Chief Ovid Mercredi of the Assembly of First Nations, who advocated for exactly that. He said, a national bilateral process to implement treaties.
Right.
And he also emphasized the inherent right to self-government.
Such an important statement, because it connects so many key ideas like working together, recognizing rights, and supporting self-determination. This report really gets you thinking, but what does this mean for everyday Canadians? Why should they care about all this? It's a good question. It's not just legal stuff or historical details. It's about understanding our country and how the past still affects us today. These treaties are a part of our shared history, and they impact millions of Canadians.
I'm starting to see how these big concepts have real consequences for people. It's about their lives, their identity, and their future.
Exactly. These treaties are living agreements that shape the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in Canada. And this report challenges us to deal with that.
It feels like we've covered so much, but there's still so much to learn. We've talked about the big ideas, but what about specifics? Like, what do these treaties say about things like fishing rights, land use, and surrendering versus sharing?
Right. That's where things get interesting. Because the report shows there's no agreement on some of these basic questions. For example, the Crown often interpreted treaties as a one-time purchase of Aboriginal title.
Oh.
But that's not how Aboriginal people saw it at all.
They saw it as sharing, not giving up their rights.
Exactly. And you see this tension when the report separates historical and modern treaties.
Oh, so historical treaties are the ones negotiated before Aboriginal people had access to lawyers.
Right. And the report says focusing only on what those old treaties say can be unfair.
Makes sense.
It's like trying to understand a conversation by hearing only one side. So to really grasp the meaning, we need to consider oral traditions, the historical context, and especially the perspectives of both sides.
It's about getting the whole picture. But this leads to another big question. How do you implement agreements that are so unclear and incomplete, especially when people disagree on what they mean?
That's a great question. And the report pushes for a new process where both treaty nations and the Crown work together to bridge those gaps in understanding and come up with solutions that benefit everyone.
So it's not about imposing solutions or quick fixes. It's about dialogue and partnership and recognizing the unique parts of each treaty.
You're exactly right. It emphasizes that the relationship between the Crown and Aboriginal people isn't static. It needs to adapt to changing situations.
Right at the beginning, the report highlights those core values of mutual recognition, respect sharing, and responsibility.
Absolutely. Those are the foundation for a renewed relationship, one that moves past colonial power dynamics and embraces a true partnership. But let's dig into some of the legal ideas that have shaped how these treaties have been handled.
Okay, one term that I remember getting stuck on was fiduciary duty.
Oh yeah, that's an important one. It basically means that the Crown has a responsibility to act in the best interests of Aboriginal peoples. It's like being a guardian or a trustee. It's not just about following the law. It's about protecting and supporting the well-being of treaty nations.
It's about going above and beyond just the bare minimum.
Exactly. And the report says this hasn't really happened, which has led to a lot of the problems we see today.
So that concept of fiduciary duty could be really powerful if it was put into practice.
It would shift things from a purely transactional relationship to one built on trust and responsibility. And while we're talking about obligations, the report also brings up fundamental breach.
Okay, what does that one mean? It sounds serious.
It is. Basically, it means that when one side of an agreement doesn't do what it promised, the other side can say the whole agreement is broken.
So if the Crown doesn't keep its promises, treaty nations could say the whole thing is void.
The report says that's a valid argument, especially when historical treaties have been ignored or broken. It raises big questions about the whole relationship between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples. But the report isn't saying we should just throw out all the treaties. It's more like saying this is a possibility if things can't be resolved fairly.
So it's a last resort.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting point. The report is trying to balance things. It acknowledges the problems with the legal system, but it also says the law can be used to make things better.
I see. It's not about just changing the laws or looking for quick fixes. It's about transforming relationships, shifting power, and ultimately changing Canada.
Exactly. It's a big job. But the report says we have to do it. The future depends on addressing these injustices and creating a society based on mutual respect and understanding.
It sounds like a huge challenge, but also a chance to create a better future for everyone.
I agree. Honoring these treaties gives us a chance to make Canada a fairer and more prosperous place for all.
Welcome back. We're jumping right back into our deep dive on restructuring the relationship. Last time we really got into how complex it is to interpret those treaties and the impact that has on reconciliation efforts between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples here in Canada.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
It feels like a big job trying to connect those different points of view and find a path forward.
It is for sure. And that's why this report is so interesting. It doesn't just say what the problems are. It gives us a framework for change. A way to start building that new relationship with respect and understanding on both sides.
Right, so it's not just looking back, it's about taking action to make a better future. We ended last time talking about how we need to understand those regional differences.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how those differences actually play out?
Well, every treaty has its own history, its own set of promises and challenges. For example, treaties on the East Coast often focus on fishing rights, while treaties out on the prairies are more about land use and access to resources.
So each treaty really reflects the needs and priorities of the people who made them and where they lived.
Exactly. And we have to recognize those differences if we want to come up with solutions that work. A one-size-fits-all approach just won't do it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So how does the report say we should move forward while respecting those regional differences?
One of the main things it recommends is creating a national bilateral treaty process. This would mean setting up a permanent space where treaty nations and the Crown can meet as equals to talk about and work through issues together.
So a place for ongoing dialogue and negotiation.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's not about forcing solutions on anyone. It's about making a system where everyone has a voice and can work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
That sounds like a much better approach than what's been done in the past.
It is. But it wouldn't be easy.
Yeah.
Especially with all the regional differences we talked about.
Oh, for sure. What kind of challenges do you think we'd run into?
Implementing a national process like that, while still making sure to respect regional differences, would take a ton of planning and coordination.
Yeah.
And we would also have to acknowledge the power imbalances that have existed between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples for so long.
Right. It's not just about setting up a new process. It's about changing how those in power approach these negotiations.
Absolutely. It's about moving from a top-down approach to a real partnership with shared decision-making.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how do we even start to fill in those gaps in the historical record, especially when it comes to those early treaties?
That's a huge issue, and the report tackles it head on.
Right.
It says we need to move away from only relying on the written text of the treaties because they often show the biases of the Crown.
Right.
Instead, it encourages us to consider other sources of information.
What kind of sources?
Well, oral histories are a big one. Aboriginal peoples have always passed down their knowledge and traditions through stories and spoken accounts.
So by including those oral histories in the process, we can get a more complete understanding of what the agreements meant to everyone involved.
Exactly. It's about filling in the gaps, acknowledging the perspectives that have been ignored, and creating a more balanced and truthful account of what happened.
That makes sense. But I can see how there might be challenges with trying to include oral histories in a legal system. How do you prove if an oral account is accurate? How do you weigh it against a written document?
Those are great questions. And that's where historians, anthropologists, and legal experts come in. The report says we need a team of specialists to document and assess those oral histories to make sure they're accurate and authentic.
It's a big job, but an important one if we really want to honor the spirit of these agreements. And it's not just about historical accuracy, is it?
You're right. It's also about respecting the ongoing cultural and spiritual significance of these agreements for treaty nations. To them, those treaties aren't just old documents. They represent a living relationship with the land and their own identity.
It's a lot deeper than just the legal stuff. We're talking about different ways of seeing the world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about understanding that knowledge can come from many sources. And that's a big part of reconciliation, isn't it? Acknowledging different perspectives and working together for a better future.
You've got it. So we've talked about the importance of regional differences and bringing in oral histories. But what about those 4 pillars we talked about earlier? Treaties, governance lands, and resources and economic development. How does the report recommend we handle those in a way that supports reconciliation?
Well, let's start with governance. The report is all about making self-government stronger for treaty nations.
Okay, remind me, what does that actually look like?
It means giving treaty nations more control over their own affairs. Things like their land, their resources, and their laws. It means moving away from that old system where the government made all the decisions.
So it's about empowering treaty nations to make their own choices about their future.
You got it. It's about respecting their right to self-determination. And it's not just about giving them more autonomy. It's also about giving them the resources and support they need to run their communities effectively.
That makes sense. It's about giving them the power to shape their own destiny. But it's not just about how they govern themselves, right? The report also talks about how they participate in the Canadian political system.
Right.
Like having a say in decisions that affect them.
Exactly. It's about making sure their voices are heard on things that impact their lives and their land. And that leads right into the next pillar, lands and resources.
Okay, let's talk about that one. That's a really complicated issue.
It is. And the report knows that there aren't any easy solutions. It says we need to focus on settling land claims in a way that's fair and efficient.
We've heard so much about land claims. Can you remind me what they actually are and why they're so important?
A land claim is when an Aboriginal group says that their treaty rights or their Aboriginal title haven't been recognized or have been violated in some way.
So it's about getting back what was promised to them.
Exactly. And it could be a really long and difficult process with negotiations, legal battles, and sometimes even international involvement.
That sounds like a tough fight. So how does the report say we can make that process more fair?
It recommends setting up an independent tribunal to oversee those land claims. This tribunal would have the power to make decisions about the claims, making sure the whole process is fair and impartial.
So taking it out of the hands of the government and making a neutral space for those claims to be heard.
Exactly. It's about leveling the playing field so treaty nations can stand up for their rights without worrying about political influence.
And that would probably help to speed up the process too, right? Because these things can drag on forever.
That's the goal. The report really stresses how important it is to resolve land claims quickly and fairly, because leaving those issues unresolved has big consequences.
It sounds like the report is really trying to come at this from different angles. It's not just about laws and policies, but also about finding practical solutions.
Absolutely. It's about building a system that's both fair and effective, and recognizing how important it is to resolve these disputes.
We've covered so much, and it's clear that to make these changes happen, everyone would have to change how they think and act. But before we move on, can we talk about that 4th pillar, economic development? How does the report address that one?
That's a really important piece of the puzzle, because without economic independence, real self-determination is impossible. The report stresses the need for a multifaceted approach to economic growth in treaty nations' communities.
So it's not just about giving money or creating government programs.
Right. It's about giving treaty nations the power to build their own sustainable economies.
So combining traditional knowledge and practices with modern economic tools and strategies.
Exactly. And it's about getting rid of the barriers that prevent them from participating in the economy, like limited access to funding or discrimination in hiring.
So leveling the playing field so they can compete fairly.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's also about supporting businesses and entrepreneurship within treaty nations communities.
It sounds like a really well-rounded plan to create economic opportunities and break the cycle of poverty that has affected so many treaty nations. It's about creating a future where they can make their own choices, not just politically, but economically too.
That's what it's all about. It's about a future where treaty nations are strong and self-governing and contributing to the success of Canada as a whole. It's a pretty bold vision.
It is. It sounds like the report is saying we need to completely rethink how we see the relationship between the Crown and Aboriginal peoples in Canada. It's not just about making small changes, it's about creating something entirely new.
It's a huge shift.
Yeah.
And it won't be easy. There will be challenges and pushback along the way.
Definitely. We've already talked about the lack of trust and awareness as big problems, but what are some of the other obstacles that the report points out?
One of the biggest challenges is just how big this task is. We're talking about changing attitudes and systems that have been around for centuries. It requires us to completely rethink how we see things, to move away from those old colonial ideas of power and embrace a true partnership.
That's a lot to ask. It's going to take a lot of commitment from the government and a willingness to face some difficult truths about our past.
It is. And even if everyone agrees that this needs to happen, there's still the problem of resources. Putting these recommendations into action would take a lot of money, especially in areas like education, economic development, and dealing with land claims.
So it's not just about wanting to do it, it's about making sure there's enough money to actually make it happen.
Exactly. And then there's the challenge of getting everyone on the same page. Yep. We're talking about different levels of government, federal, provincial, and territorial, each with their own laws and policies. Making this work would require a level of cooperation that hasn't always been there.
It's a huge job. It's not just about changing laws. It's about changing relationships and power and creating a whole new way of seeing Canada.
It is. But the report says it has to be done. The future of Canada depends on fixing these injustices and building a society based on respect and understanding.
It's a powerful message. It's a reminder that reconciliation is not just about fixing the past, it's about building a better future for everyone in Canada.
Absolutely. And the report reminds us that we all have a role to play in this. Despite all the challenges, it ends with a message of hope. It acknowledges the strength and resilience of treaty nations and believes that a different kind of relationship is possible. One based on respect and shared success.
This deep dive has shown me how complex this is, but it's also given me hope that a better future is possible. This report feels like more than just a report. It's a plan. It's a call to action.
It is. It's telling each of us to learn more, to get involved, and to push for change.
It's been really interesting exploring these ideas with you, and I hope our listeners are feeling motivated to keep learning about these important issues.
Me too. And don't forget, reconciliation isn't a finish line. It's a journey. It's a process that takes constant effort and a willingness to learn and grow.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another interesting topic to explore.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep working towards a better world.